Hello, everyone. I want to talk about suicide quickly. So, as you all probably know by now, Robin Williams has committed suicide just a few days ago. And before I go on, let me just say this really quickly. I hate suicide, and I hate it especially when men commit suicide, especially in response to financial troubles brought on by divorce. I don't like suicide of any kind, but specifically that type of suicide gets to me, which in Robin Williams' case seems to have been at least a contributing factor, if not a major factor, in his suicide, considering that he was on his third marriage after two divorces that costed him tens of millions of dollars. I guess he just, failed to pick the right girl, according to some. I guess he just failed to filter out the, virtuous women and whatnot. But I specifically want to focus on the reaction to the news of his suicide by our society and our media and all that. Now, A Voice for Men ran an article on his suicide, which is in the description box, where they mentioned Fox News' Shepard Smith, quoting in a video what Robin Williams said about his children and how much he loved them and how much he loved watching them grow up into adulthood. And then Shepard Smith speculates as to why he committed suicide, knowing how much he loved his kids. And then he speculates, in typical Fox News pundit gynocentric fashion, as to whether or not it was his cowardice that caused him to kill himself. He actually, only a few days after the man's death, accused him of potential cowardice because this man, who was clearly suffering, didn't stay alive for the children, essentially. And this type of talk makes me violently angry. I mean, it just infuriates me. And so I admit that I'm making this video perhaps with a bit of bias due to my personal over-emotional reaction to it. But again, this channel, first and foremost, is dedicated to rising above the primitive lizard brain and understanding what it means to be human. So I'll try to lay aside my emotions and analyze why this happens and why our society reacts this way to male suicide specifically. Now, I admit that the rest of this video is highly speculative, but perhaps it can shed some light on the human condition, and I believe one of the best ways to treat things like suicide and depression that doesn't necessarily involve antidepressants or medication or medicating the symptoms away is to seek understanding of oneself. So many potentially suicidal people seek therapy as a result of treatment for their depression, and I've always believed that in doing this, this is not the person seeking to be treated, but the person seeking to understand him or herself, which is a form of treatment in and of itself. So yes, I'll repeat myself here. One of the best ways to curb human depression and suicide and human dissatisfaction overall is to gain a solid understanding of who we are and why we behave the way we do, and this video will attempt to do that. Now bear with me here because I'm going to read to you an article I found from nationaljournal.com titled, quote, "This is literally the formula for happiness," in which a mathematical equation was given, and this is a study that measured instances of happiness as opposed to overall happiness, and you'll see what I mean by that in a second. But instances of happiness were measured in response to participants accruing wins and losses playing a board game, which was later ported over to a smartphone game. And the article reads, quote, and this is August 5th, 2014. And again, this article is in the description box for anybody who wants to read it. Quote, "What is an instance of happiness? That's a squishy question philosophers have discussed for millennia. According to Spark Notes, Aristotle said happiness is an end to itself. The poet Khalil Gibran wrote that happiness is, quote, your sorrow unmasked, whatever that means. Rhetoric aside, researchers at the University College of London says happiness, or at least a discrete moment of it, is represented by the formula above, recently published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The gist of that formula is this: happiness spikes when we win and our expectations are low, but that happiness gradually fades over time. To be clear, the scientists weren't studying overall life satisfaction, but rather the momentary joy that comes from winning a reward. With MRI machines, the researchers peered into the minds of 26 subjects who were playing a gambling game. And throughout the game, the computer asked participants to rate how happy they were on a 1 to 10 scale. The researchers then not so simply combined brain activity data with the reported level of happiness and the participants' history of success in the game and crafted the above equation. What they found was that it wasn't the overall amount of money won in the game that gave participants the greatest happiness. The formula incorporates a, quote, forgetting factor, which predicts what the happiness obtained from a previous win and how it degrades over time. 10 more trials after a win, the original win essentially has no influence on current happiness. According to the formula, happiness spikes when things go better than expected. For example, the study concludes, a £0 prize decreases happiness if the alternative was winning £2, but increases happiness if the alternative was losing £2. Which makes perfect sense. It's better to win when that win avoids a bigger loss. But what's surprising about this study is that the researchers were then able to use that formula to predict the general pattern of happiness in more than 18,000 people playing a similar game on a smartphone, end quote. Now, isn't that interesting? In reading this, I couldn't help but think back to the scene in The Matrix, and I know it's cliche to quote The Matrix or reference it, but it's cliche for a reason, because the movie it's chock full of insight into what makes humans tick. But the scene I'm referencing here is the one where Morpheus is captured in the first installment of the trilogy by the infamous Agent Smith, who informs Morpheus right before he begins to interrogate him that the first Matrix, that is the first false reality that was constructed by machines to facilitate the harvesting of humans, for the few of you who haven't watched it yet. But he informs Morpheus that the first Matrix was designed to be a utopia, the ideal human paradise where none suffered and none went without, and everyone was content. And he goes on to say that this approach to keeping humans in their dream state was an utter disaster. Human beings could not, it seemed, be swayed into unconsciousness by the lullaby of pure happiness and bliss, but human consciousness was instead domesticated by offering them a simulation of the current pinnacle of civilization, which was depicted as an urban Western metropolis. So in this movie, what rendered the human spirit into surrendering was, again, not a utopia, but our current world, which for all of its advances still contains much suffering. And Agent Smith speculates that the reason for this is because human beings, according to him, are a species that define their reality not through happiness and contentedness, but through misery and suffering, and how much of that misery and suffering we're experiencing in our lives versus how much others are experiencing in theirs. Now again, I admit this may be pure conjecture with no value to it whatsoever. But still, I can't help ask the question of why we're more happier when we avoid, in this previous study that I cited, losing money than we are when we win the same amount of money. Is there something to this claim that we derive our purpose and meaning through struggle and misery? I'd like to read a quote from Gene Simmons of the band Kiss, in which he appears to have very little sympathy for people suffering from depression and substance abuse, which are of course at a higher risk for suicide themselves. And he says, quote, "I don't get along with anybody who's a drug addict and has a dark cloud over their head and sees themselves as a victim. Drug addicts and alcoholics are always, oh, the world is a harsh place. My mother was in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany. I don't want to hear fuck all about the world is a harsh place. She gets up every day, smells the roses, and lives life." And for a putz, a 20-year-old kid to say, quote, "I'm depressed, I live in Seattle, fuck you then, kill yourself," end quote. Now, I'm not here to say that, some depressed kid in Seattle could ever envision the type of suffering and misery that Gene Simmons' mother endured while living in a Nazi concentration camp. I'm not saying that in the slightest. But the question that I ask to you is, who do you think appreciates life more? The Seattleite trendy with no direction and, more importantly, no time in his life where he's endured a meaningful hardship, or the Holocaust survivor who's seen first and foremost how transient life is and how thin the line between life and death really is? Who's more likely to take the time to smell the roses in this scenario? I would say that the Holocaust survivor does. I would say that the Holocaust survivor has learned to derive happiness from merely existing as a direct result of the misery and suffering he or she survived. And I would argue that the depressed Seattleite trendy is arguably suffering from more discontent and more likely to take their own life once certain conditions are in place, if it is in fact true that we derive some morbid sense of masochistic meaning through our own suffering. And now all of this brings me back to Robin Williams. Now, Robin Williams didn't go through a Holocaust. I'm assuming that his entire life was devoid of any single event that is comparable to the suffering and misery one undergoes during something like the Holocaust. So according to people like Gene Simmons, he should never have killed himself. He had it pretty good after all. Not like his mom, who still manages to smell the roses every day. So what killed him then? Or what made him decide to kill himself, rather? I posit that it was a different, but just as potent kind of suffering. I posit that there are different kinds of suffering, and I posit that human beings react differently to these different kinds of misery. And I think that when human beings are confronted with a seemingly insurmountable and horrific existence, like that of someone experiencing the day-to-day horrors of a concentration camp existence, I think that this is when we're most likely, as a species, to double down in our resolve, to convene with a spirit of resiliency and our survival instinct. And I think that it is instead a slow, constant descent into nothingness and numbness and normalcy over time, drip by drip, like some sort of mental Chinese water torture. I think it's that existence that destroys our will. I think it's that existence that destroys our will to live much more efficiently than anything else. And in Robin Williams' case, I see a man that was destroyed via this method. I see a man that was subjected to a constant betrayal that simmered and smoldered, that destroys the male desire for adventure and knowledge, and I think that's what killed him. His first divorce, and then his second divorce, which caused him tens of millions of dollars, along with what had to be years of mental anguish and feelings of betrayal that comes with divorce. Slowly but surely, I think when it started dawning on him that he would have to return to work at an age where he should have been retiring, all to support his wives and children from 2 previous marriages, maybe it was that killed his sense of adventure and wonder, and maybe the crushing numbness of that existence was what finally got to him in the end. Again, this is all very speculative, but it's food for thought. And maybe we can explore this in the future. That's all I gotta say for now.